This is the Where Data Meets Business podcast, in which we discuss how data driven approaches can help you achieve business outcomes bigger, better, faster. We also talk about careers, leadership, entrepreneurship, and the people factor in data and tech. If you like what you hear, don't forget to hit subscribe and share. I'm your host, Sonia Ketkar, former academic and researcher, current consultant, data enthusiast, and forever New Yorker. In this episode, we spoke with Jeff Seltzer. Jeff co founded Hypothesis Inc. and led its transition from a boutique startup consultancy into a nearly $30 million plus top 25 custom insights and strategy agency. Under his leadership, the company grew to nearly 100 employees and partnered with premier clients including Meta, Toyota, Disney, Starbucks, Spotify, Microsoft, and Apple. In 2024, after more than 2 decades, Jeff oversaw the successful acquisition of Hypothesis by Elixirr, a London based management consulting firm, marking a strategic exit that enabled him to pursue new ventures and personal passions. Before co founding Hypothesis, Jeff held senior positions at several consumer insights firms and served as an adjunct faculty member at George Washington University and San Diego State University. Jeff, thank you for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, we got acquainted now several years ago when I worked at Disney, and your company Hypothesis was involved with collecting data and providing some insights for one of the Disney business units. Can you share your professional journey up to that point? How did you get there from the beginning to having Disney as a client?
Wow. Well, that's a great question, and it's a long journey. So I'll try to summarize. So I graduated with a master's degree in communications from San Diego State University. So let's start there. My The emphasis of my degree was experimental design and persuasion, rhetoric. That's the area of study. So when I graduated, I accepted a teaching job at uh, GW, George Washington University, as an adjunct faculty member teaching persuasion. I thought I wanted to be in academia. Taught taught there. Quickly realized that teaching at that level wasn't for me for a variety of reasons. Mostly, I didn't like grading papers. That's what I decided. So I started trying to network, make connections. I found another professor working at GW that had a small market research company. So I joined him. There was about three or four of us, and I learned the ropes of B2B and B2C consumer insights, writing a survey, doing data analysis, that kind of stuff. And this was, in the late 90s, in the early days of email surveys and online panels. So it's sort of an exciting time. Those things just didn't. Now they're commonplace. They didn't exist then. So it was sort of fun there. I turned out didn't like Washington D.C. much for a variety of reasons, mostly centered around the weather, to be honest. So found my way back to Los Angeles, Southern California, where I took a job at Lieberman Research Worldwide, which is now Material. And that is where I met Maria Stark, who was my co-founder at Hypothesis. So we never really worked together much at Lieberman. We just knew each other in the hallways. And she decided that she wanted to leave Lieberman. This is around 2000, 2001 or so, and start a qualitative boutique research agency. And at the time, boutique research agencies didn't exist. You were either a freelancer or you worked for a big firm. There was no such really thing as a boutique firm. So she left and she decided to start Hypothesis as this really creative boutique. And she quickly realized that she needed some type of quantitative capability. And so while I love qualitative research and I've moderated hundreds of focus groups, my training was more in quantitative. So we had lunch one day and she said, "Come help me build this company." I said, "Great." So that's when I joined forces with Maria. And getting back to the long-winded response to your question, how did we get Disney? Disney was the first client that we worked with at Lieberman, and then followed us to Hypothesis. And so Disney, and I believe Disney remains a top 5 or top 10 client of Hypothesis today. But that's how we found our way to working with you.
Got it. When she approached you, what made you want to get into this very unpredictable world of having your own business?
Well, let's zoom in on that time because there was a couple things that I left out. So she left Lieberman to start Hypothesis, the qual shop. That very same week, I left Lieberman to join a company called Lightspan. I left that out because it's a very small part of the story here. But I joined Lightspan. And you might be asking yourself, what is Lightspan? Lightspan does not exist anymore. Lightspan was a company that did educational technology. And I joined Lightspan as the head of consumer insights there. And I did consumer insights mostly with kids and family and teachers and moms. And that lasted about 6 months. And then the internet bubble burst. And I got laid off. It was a very, very difficult thing to hear. I think it's very relevant today, considering what's happening. But I thought I was untouchable. I knew the work I did there was valuable. I was highly regarded. Um, it was not even in my thought that the company would struggle and I would be called into HR and they would say, Jeff, we value you, but today's your last day. They gave me a small severance package and my then wife was pregnant. I had a new house. I was going through all the panicking kind of emotions, and I said, "Well, I'm going to try to just sort of freelance and do what I can to make ends meet." And that's when I reached out to Maria, who had just started Hypothesis, and she said, "Well, you're in this situation. Let's join forces." So I'd like to sit here and tell the audience that it was some strong entrepreneurial, blood running through me, and I had this brilliant idea of a boutique quantitative component and all those things. But the reality is, I was laid off, and I had to make my next move. And so I often will tell people who have been in this similar situation all through the years that getting laid off can actually force you to make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't have made, and could really lead to some life changing a life changing path. And that was the case for me. So that was the impetus to joining forces.
I'm so glad you shared that story because it's a lot of people's story today. There've been a lot of layoffs all over corporate America. And yeah, a lot of folks are just reevaluating what they want to do. I'm sure that's going to resonate with a lot of folks. Getting back to Hypothesis, you join Hypothesis, you're a part of it, you become a co-founder, and then comes the part where you have to set yourself apart, right, as a company and then start getting those clients, which is not easy when you're a newbie. So, how did you go about doing that?
We went about it slowly and methodically. We knew what set us apart was primarily a client service orientation that at the time, and I think is still very much the case now with a lot of companies, there were a lot of these bigger companies have a pass down model where they have a salesperson or some senior person who creates a proposal, sells the research in, and then at the end of the day, it's really junior people conducting the research. A lot of times clients won't even have any conversations with the people that initially were involved in the proposal. And that was a key difference with Hypothesis, that the same people that were designing the research and creating the proposal were the same people that were going to be conducting the research, putting the charts together, writing the executive summary. In part because there was only two of us, right? So who else would there was no one to pass down to anyway, even if we wanted to. But that was one thing that differentiated us. But overall, there was a level of creativity that we wanted to add to the research process that didn't exist at the time. And again, arguably is not the norm now. And by creativity, I mean creativity in terms of designing a research program, creativity of when you're in a focus group, the exercises, the approach that you apply, creativity quantitatively with the methods and the analysis that we choose, and especially, and I would say this was the number one differentiator and still remains the number one differentiator of hypothesis today, creativity in terms of how the findings, the recommendations, the data are presented. So Maria and I, one of the things that would bind us together and still does to this day is we're both come from an artistic world. Maria, before Hypothesis, owned an art gallery. And she is, anyone that knows her, she is an amazing, astute collector of art. Her art collection is amazing. And I'm basically a failed artist in many ways. My undergrad major was art. I used to paint. To this day, I still am a photographer. And I think we talked earlier, if you Google my name, you're probably more likely to see my photography than you are anything relating to hypothesis or market research. But I've always loved art. I've always been a very visual person. So one of the early differentiators was our presentations and how we embrace a artistic way of communicating data. So that's how we positioned ourselves. But it still was very slow to get acceptance. We were very fortunate with Disney because that was a client that followed us. So that gave us a lot of credibility. As you know, Disney is sort of it's like getting your hand stamped at a really exclusive nightclub that will follow you around for your entire career. So our ability to say hypothesis works with Disney helped us get other clients, but we still had to prove ourselves, and that didn't happen in weeks or months. It happened over years. And Disney, even though they knew us and liked us, they were hesitant to give us really, really big projects. They were hesitant to give us trackers. It took years and years before we got any type of trackers for them. So it was really a acceptance that it would take a long time. And I always would say, and I did up until my last day at Hypothesis, just do good work. And the good work will be the way that we get further into existing clients and are able to attract new clients. Just do good work.
Yeah. So you mentioned the creativity piece when you were talking about the differentiating factor for hypothesis at the time. And I think that is super interesting because right now, where everybody's talking about using tools for everything and almost discounting the value of having people be there and be able to add that creativity on the spot during interactions, I think that hits home a really important point that we need to keep in mind as this world moves forward with AI. But coming back to that slow growth that you were referring to, what was the inflection point then where you felt like, okay, now this is taking a turn and now we are in, there's no such thing as safe territory in a business, but now we are getting to that point where we were more comfortable or we have more reliable revenue than you did previously.
Yeah, I think there's definitely inflection points along the way. I think that you can divide the journey up to chapters. And I would say that the inflection point in the first chapter, the early on um, part of hypothesis, was our first couple of hires. That's when we felt a stronger sense of certainty that clients would come back. We had repeat clients. We had clients that called us, which was amazing. And we got to the point where we said, we can't do all of this work. And I think that that's a key thing to zero in on because I come across a lot of small business owners or entrepreneur people that are trying to start out or freelance or do whatever, maybe build something small. And they get to this point where they they have the opportunity to do more work, but they're afraid they can't do it. And they often will turn down work. And that's the inflection point where we had a decision to make. We could say, listen, we want to be able to continue to do really high quality work. We want to be able to give clients the attention, the high level senior attention that they came to us for. So what do we do here? Do we say no? Do we turn down the work because we're afraid we'll perform poorly? Or do we just say yes? And that's the inflection point. That happened where we sat down and we said, we will never say no to a client. We will always say yes, and then we will figure it out. And I think that that is perhaps a risky way of operating, but it served us well because our philosophy was say yes and then yes if we can do something, and it was yes if we can hire more people we can do this. So when we said yes to this project, and I don't remember what the project was, but I'm sure it was, we were looking at going, oh my god, how are we going to do this? The answer was we can do it if we hire. And that's when we hired our first person. And I'll give her a shout out. Her name is Christina Seiden. I'm still good friends with her today. And it was a huge hire for us because we hired her away from Lieberman, as it turned out. She was a sort of rising star at Lieberman, and she was well regarded with her clients. And she brought to Hypothesis a strong methodical approach to work that frankly I lacked and that Maria lacked. So we brought in someone that did things better than us, that gave us more credibility with clients and made us into a small firm versus just two of us doing research. And once we saw how that could work, once we saw bring in really smart good people that can do things better than you in some cases, clients will recognize that and they'll come back for additional work. And that's when the company started to grow.
So, and I believe that it grew quite a lot from there, right? You went from the first and second hire to what number were you at roughly by the time you exited? 100?
We were, I think at the height of Hypothesis, we were close to 100 employees. I don't think there was that many employees when the company was acquired. I don't know. It was probably 70 or 75. That's mostly because we started to outsource some more things, became more efficient in some other areas. That's with professional services. The single largest expense you have is payroll, and so you're constantly trying to balance your payroll to the revenue coming in. So when we were close to 100, it was probably too many people, and so we scaled that back a bit. But yeah, it grew from the initial 3 or 4 people. What we would say during the first couple chapters of Hypothesis, and that that was maybe 10 years, the first couple chapters, long chapters. If we could add a client or two every year and maybe make a good hire or two every year, that was success. We that's how we measured our success. It wasn't with financials as much as people and quality clients, and we always knew the money would come. So that's how we grew. When we moved into where Hypothesis is headquartered now at the Fine Arts Building in downtown Los Angeles, we moved into the sixth floor. There were seven of us, and that was in 2007. And that's still where they're headquartered, and that's where there was at that 40, 50 employees. We had employees in other states and things like that, but it really grew slowly at first and then took off.
So a lot of smaller companies, as they're starting out, they have the slow growth, and then suddenly, as you pointed out, then the explosive growth, and then you have to hire a lot of people very quickly and all of that. What was your experience with that when you're trying to hire quickly? How do you identify the right people? Do you realize later that they are maybe not the right people? Do you have any
Yes.
experiences like that to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, the managing the employees and the staff by far was the hardest part of Hypothesis. The research part was relatively easy. Just do good work. Managing people was the difficult part. So early on, we would hire these people and we would be very careful and selective. I mean, I remember we would take weeks and weeks to identify someone and hire them, but we could take our time to really identify people and interview them and go out to lunch with them, make sure they fit culturally, make sure they were one of us. We would always say they thought like us, they had the same ethos when it came to client service and skill set. As we grew, as we won larger projects, we had to hire, as you say, in a more rapid way. And it was difficult. It was difficult to, maybe our reputation started to grow and it was easier to attract people with headhunters and stuff. But early on, during that growth phase, we definitely made mistakes. We made mistakes in terms of maybe taking a risk on people that in hindsight, we said, well, we had these doubts, but we needed to hire, so we did it anyway. Sometimes we just blew it. They weren't who we thought they were. Um, and that was a big source of growing pains. It was the hiring. We got really much better at it as we went along, but you learn from your mistakes. I think that was one of the lessons is you can't learn from your mistakes if you don't make mistakes. So if you're so paralyzed to make decisions, you're never going to benefit from those decisions down the line. And I think that as we sort of the big growth years, I would say 2012, 13, 14, 15, around those, we were able to look back at a lot of mistakes and say, you know, we want to hire this person, but remember that other person we hired, doesn't he or she remind you of that? So we could really learn and make better hires. And I think when I left in the last few years that I was there, we were really good at hiring. We made far fewer mistakes than we did sort of in the middle years.
So, if you could get a little more specific about that, if you were to give advice to somebody else who is hiring based on the lessons that you learn, what would you tell them to do or take note of, or the reverse?
A few things come to mind. I think one is that you're never hiring in it alone. There's always a small group of decision makers. So one, I would say, make sure that it's a small group of decision makers. I think one of the lessons we learned is that you don't want to have too many chefs in the kitchen, right? So two or three people is enough. Call it three people is enough to of a committee to make a choice. I think one of our earlier mistakes was we had way too many people. Secondly, I would say when you have that small group, you should be unanimous. If anyone has a red flag or a gut instinct against a person, listen to that. We found that when we go back and look at the mistakes we made, there was always one person in the decision group that had that gut feeling. So it wasn't a big shocker. So listen to those, listen to the gut, listen to the red flags. And if you all aren't in agreement, take a pause. I would also say that one of the lessons we learned was that the biggest predictor, the strongest predictor of success of an employee is recommendation and referrals. That people who worked for us were the best people at identifying potential new employees. And so we really started to emphasize referrals. We gave referral bonuses. We found that people that refer to us from their network, that was a really strong predictor because at the end of the day, who knows you best but your own employees? So if they're recommending someone or helping to actively recruit people, we would certainly encourage that. We would have people say, "Oh yeah, I have a friend that she's at this other company. I think she would be great." And we would say, "What do we need to do to get her? Take her out to lunch. Give me her phone number or email. I'll contact." So we are very proactive in reaching out to referrals and people within a social network. That was really key. We also found that there was an interesting thing that would happen as we grew. We would want to look to people to help us grow further, to help us get to the next level. So we would try to find people that have been to where we want to go. And that was really important as well. So we would interview people that were in firms or companies or wherever that were aspirational to us. And we would want to bring them in to help us get there. So it's a difference between hiring someone who is currently where you want to go versus someone that wants to go on that journey with you. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a super interesting point. So, going into that growth period a little bit deeper and talking about the sales and the marketing piece of it. Of course, when you started off, as you mentioned, word of mouth, the good work that you've done with one client, sort of helping you get another client. Did any of the outreach, marketing, sales tactics change from that first initial period to growth maturity stage of hypothesis? And how so?
It's funny looking back to when we first started Hypothesis. It's an interesting thing to start your own company because you get to decide how you want to do things. You get to decide what you like and what you don't like, where your comfort zone is, what's out of your comfort zone. And certainly, Maria and I were on the same page in terms of sales. And that is it's very uncomfortable for us. We're not big salespeople. Like I said, I would always say that our number one sales tactic is just do good work and the rest will follow. And that certainly was the case in the first part of Hypothesis. We would just do good work. One day we would get an email from a potential client that says, "Hey, I've heard about you guys and want to talk to you about a new project." And it was all great. But as the company grew, we had to rely on that less, right? Because we had a much higher payroll. We had a need for larger projects. We wanted more revenue. And it became very clear that we couldn't just take a reactive method to sales. So, in the last chapters of Hypothesis, we put more of an emphasis on marketing, more of an emphasis on outbound sales. We experimented with different types of sales professionals. We ended up hiring a couple people that were really highly regarded in the industry that were kind of more of that seller doer model that were really comfortable and experienced with growing accounts, and that became very necessary. It never was in my comfort zone though, and still isn't to this day.
I know that you ended up selling the company.
Mhm.
How did you and your co founder decide that it was time to sell?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's never, it's not like you're sitting there and it just hits you. It's a process, the idea of selling the company. And I think it occurred to her first, probably, that she was ready to move on to some other things that she wanted to accomplish in life. So she brought it up to me, and I felt very similar. This was the decision really occurred just right before the pandemic hit that we wanted to do this. Now, at that time, Hypothesis was over 20 years. We both agreed that the most fun part of Hypothesis was the building part, was the those early days, and that while we still loved the work we were doing, the company really had achieved a maturity level where her and I were much less involved. The company was effectively being run by a another management team that we had put in place and empowered, and sort of the passion that we had to run Hypothesis was more behind this than in front of us. And we explored, well, what would that mean? How would we sell a company? And it was about that time that the thought process started.
And then how do you go from making that decision to actually selling it? Because I know they're presumably finding a buyer and then telling your company employees about it. So
Right.
could you walk me through that?
Yeah. It's not like you just go to CarMax and ask for it. It's like not like selling a car, that's for sure. So
Yeah, that would have been
we,
easy.
it would have been easy. This certainly easy is not a word that comes to mind when you're selling your company. So we talk to people. I think that's that was our first step. We talked to people that we knew were in the world of mergers and acquisitions. We talked to people that had sold their company, and we really just tried to learn as much about the process as possible because there's lots of different ways to do it. And what we decided is that we were and are very proud of Hypothesis, of what we built, the reputation that we had, the people that we put together, the differentiators in the marketplace. And our desire was very, very strongly to keep the company going, but allow us to exit. So the first thing that we did is we had to solidify a management team. We had to make sure that there was a strong team in place so that a potential company acquiring would see that Maria and I were not as necessary to running the business. So we went about doing that. We would just recognize what was already happening. And that's about the time we named Maria Vallis as CEO, and she's still CEO. And she had her trusted team around her, and we just lifted them. This was a transition that was very purposeful and very natural and organic, and it allowed the company to effectively function with Maria Stark and I not in the day to day of the company. And once we let that process take shape over a year or two, that's when we hired investment bankers. We solicited offers for the company. And ultimately, we landed on the Elixirr, who purchased the company. They're a London-based management consulting firm, and we felt they were a really good fit to acquire Hypothesis. So we did not go the route of private equity. We went a strategic purchase because we wanted a company that where 1 + 1 would equal 3, and that's what happened.
And are you still involved with the company?
No, I'm not involved in the company, and neither is Maria Stark, the co-founder. And that was a certainly a bittersweet outcome. For so long was such a big part of my life that it would be the first thing I think about when I wake up, and a lot of times the last thing I thought about before I went to sleep. As part of the transaction, as part of the exit, and this is what we wanted. It was for Maria and I to be out. You can't be a little bit in, right? You're either in or you're out. And we made a decision to be out. It was the management team was effectively running the company. Everything was humming along, and we really set it up for success. Now, uh, I'm an investor in the company, in the larger entity, um, because I believe in what they're doing, and that was part of the transaction. But don't even have a Hypothesis email.
So now that you've had some time to kind of step away, and I don't know if you've spent time reflecting on your journey, the 20 plus year journey with Hypothesis, what do you think about some of the lessons that you learned? Would you do anything differently if you were to go back and revisit?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because I'm very happy with the outcome, and I'm very happy with what we built. I'm very proud of what we built. And you ask what could we do differently? What would we, how if we could go back? I'm sure if you gave me a list of every major or even sub-major decision that we made, I could go over those decisions and say, "Oh, I think we would have done this differently, or I think we wouldn't have opened this office, or we wouldn't have hired this person, or oh my gosh, what a disaster taking on that client. We've had to fire clients, or not a lot, but I can. I can count them on one hand with a finger or two to spare. But we had to fire clients because they were not nice to us and they weren't nice to our people. And I could say, oh, we wouldn't have taken on this client. There's a laundry list of things, decisions that we made that I could go over and debate, should we have done this. But then when you zoom out and you look at them in the aggregate, all of those things led to this point, right? And so I think the lesson that I learned was embrace those decisions, embrace those mistakes, realize that they are part of the journey, and that if you went back and changed the decision, it's like the butterfly effect. Who knows where you would be? We talked about learning from your mistakes, and again, if you didn't make them, how you? So I think that one of the lessons was just to trust your instinct, be bold, and take risk, but correct those things quickly when you realize that they weren't the right decision, and then appreciate and embrace that your journey is the totality of all of those decisions, good or bad. And so I could sit here and say, oh yeah, maybe would have done this or that differently, but they're not regrets. They're just observations of an entire journey.
Yeah, I almost have to ask this question because I'm super curious about it. But how do you fire? How do you fire a client? Because I'm sure a lot of companies have to do it. It's just one of the uncomfortable things that you have to do. So how do you do it in a way that is keeps the harmony?
Well, I'm not going to name the client, but what's funny about it is you talk about inflection points, right? Right. So the project that we won from this client was the single largest project in the history of Hypothesis. So when I got the call that we won this project, I couldn't believe it. It was a seminal point in the career journey, in my personal career journey and the Hypothesis career journey, that we were able to win this project against all the big companies, all those big companies that we looked at when we started and said, one day we're going to compete with those companies. We beat them all. Very excited. The project turned out to be a nightmare. We've all had these nightmare projects. It was much more work than we anticipated. Our employees didn't like it. No one we put on the project wanted to stay on the project. It just had a crippling effect internally. And the choice came to, is this ultimately a good thing for the company or a bad thing for the company, regardless of the revenue? And overwhelmingly, the conclusion was, this is bad. We're losing people. They're unhappy. Project's not what we thought it would be. It's not a good fit for the company. And so I literally had to, believe I wrote the client a very short memo that said, you have two choices. We can end this project, end this relationship, or you can pay us some ridiculous amount, which I knew they weren't going to pay. And they said, we're going to end the project. And I remember, so we effectively put him into a decision where we knew what the outcome was. And I remember when they told us that we weren't going to continue with them, we gathered the entire company into our kitchen area. We told them we are no longer working with this company, and we popped champagne. And we all had a toast. And it was a remarkable outcome because we talked the talk and we walked the walk. We promised our staff that we wouldn't change the company and we wouldn't do things just for revenue, and we held true to that. And we had a very nice celebration.
I have deep respect for that because it's so easy to get enamored with the revenue piece of it. And there are incentives for that too, for various reasons, as you know. But that's really a very meaningful approach. So coming back to the last stage that we were on, how do you think of success now that this chapter is behind you? And then what advice would you give to others in the field who are maybe early in their careers? and want to go down this path maybe later on?
Yeah, I'm still processing that. It's financially is one way to measure success, but it's not a satisfying way of measuring success, in my view. It's not the way I measure success. Um, Hypothesis was always very good financially. We always made money. It afforded me a lifestyle that I'm very comfortable in. It was never, I'm not going to complain about that, but that's certainly not the way I measure it. I think success for me is looking back and seeing what we built and seeing that we built something that another entity was willing to pay for and also valued. It's I take it way back to my um, uh, art, right? And I mentioned that I'm a photographer, and it's really easy for me to take photos and to look at them and say, I really like this photo. But that doesn't make it a successful photo in my view. In my view, it's a successful photo when someone decides, I want to buy that, or someone gives it a compliment, or someone else says it's a successful photo. So, in a large way, I define success on the external evaluation of what we built. And I think that that's successful. It's really easy to say, well, that doesn't matter. It's just what you think. Well, not really. There has to be some type of objective external evaluation of what you did. And I look back and I look at the work we did, the clients that we had, the people that we hired. I look back at the career trajectory and the career path of employees we hired. So employees that we brought in when they were interns or first year researchers. And I look at where they are now, that at the NFL or Starbucks or Disney or wherever they went to, and they are senior level executives. Nothing makes me prouder. I look back at Christina, who I mentioned early on, as our first employee. She runs her own shop now, and she does work for incredible companies. And I'm so proud of what she was able to do with that. And I'm so proud of Maria Vallis, who is the CEO of Hypothesis. We hired her, 14, 15 years ago. And so success to me is seeing the legacy. I think that's the way I'd summarize it. The legacy of what you have done. And legacy is determined by external forces. You don't get to decide what your legacy is. Others decide what your legacy is.
Great point. Before I let you go, what's next for you? What are you looking forward to?
That's the most common question I get. It's like when you're dating someone, you get the question of, are you ever going to get married? Right. This is the question that I get. And the short answer is I don't know yet. I'm still trying to. It hasn't. I promised myself I'd give myself a year. I'm certainly have more free time. Uh, my golf handicap has come down quite a bit. I'm very excited about that. You and I talked offline about some new small business ideas, certainly not involving the market research category whatsoever. But I like the idea of owning and building something. I'm 55 years old. I've been working, since even in grad school. I taught in grad school, so I've been working a long time, and it feels good to sort of take a beat and take a breather for a little bit. But I'm definitely looking to get back into something. And that can include advising and consulting. I think that I learned a lot of lessons along the ways, as we talked about, lots of mistakes, etc. And I think I would enjoy advising and consulting for other small companies that are looking one day to exit, so that maybe they can avoid some of the things that some of the pitfalls that we made.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're going to learn a lot by listening to this podcast, as you shared your story in a very, very authentic way, which I greatly appreciate, and I know our listeners will as well. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your insights and everything that you went through, because it's a great learning experience for everyone else who is either starting their journey or continuing on it. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, don't forget to share and subscribe. See you next time.